Stop eating and listen.
You violated the law.
Ramsay Bolton is a bit of a paradox in Game of Thrones the show. I can't claim without a light seasoning of clickbait that the show ruined his character, because in a lot of ways it did the opposite. It turned Ramsay Bolton from a highly disturbing character with a level of depth subtly hinted at, something I made a video all about by the way, but also quite a minor character really, where the show made him into one of the most iconic, memorable, arguably even thrilling things about Game of Thrones' run. It's a paradox because all of that is true, and yet I also think his character went very wrong and contributed to a lot of the problems that developed across David and Dan's slow descent from a bang into a whimper.
This is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper.
People hated Ramsay, yes, but not in the way a lot of people hated Cersei or even Joffrey, the actors behind them both receiving death threats for playing characters very well. No, people enjoyed hating Ramsay and massively respected the job Iwan Rheon was doing in his portrayal. Why there's that difference in the hatred would be an interesting video to make one day. In fact, I'd like to make a video about why Joffrey is one of my favourite characters, but for now, it's Ramsay. Shall we begin by addressing the elephant in the Dread Fort? This is the obvious point first, but we do need to mention it. The scenes YouTube doesn't like you mentioning too often, they are uncomfortable. And that itself isn't necessarily a bad thing, no, I think it is worthwhile, particularly in a show like Game of Thrones, to explore someone as dark as Ramsay, and also what it is for someone like Theon to experience that. I don't think you can accurately explore that stuff without it being uncomfortable. And the books of course do exactly the same, although admittedly the books don't often actually show you these scenes. You pick up with Theon much later on after a lot of this takes place. His internal monologue is used to hint at what he suffered without us having to sit through it all. But the show can't as easily do that because internal monologue would be a bit odd in Game of Thrones. You could circumvent that issue, but I think David and Dan knew full well that the shock factor of their show had generated a lot of its early popularity, or at least fame, and therefore it is unsurprising they lean into scenes of Ramsay harming Theon, and they lean into them too much, I think we can say. The problem here being threefold. One, it's often very gratuitous. One of their early scenes where Ramsay wakes him up with a trumpet and wants to play a game. Theon wins if he can guess who Ramsay is and why he's doing this, but Ramsay wins if he gets Theon to beg for his finger to be cut off. I think that's a well-written, chilling scene with tension, development, a good amount of exposition expressed in a creative way, and then the twist when Ramsay reveals there is no reason he's doing any of this other than that he enjoys it. That sets up everything we need to know about Ramsay with a visceral feeling of horror. It works. But then they keep doing more scenes that don't really tell us anything we need entire scenes for. That's when it increasingly becomes gratuitous, and that is also kind of point two. There's so little substance to most of this. I watched every Ramsay scene from Game of Thrones this morning, and what I quickly realised, alongside how uncomfortable these scenes with Theon are, they're also really, really boring once you know where it all goes, and once that shock factor has worn off. How the hell do scenes like this become dull? But they do, because there's no real story. The only progression is Theon slowly breaking more and more, but there's not really much conflict there when Ramsay's control is absolute, and neither is there much purpose to it. Take Reek, for example. In the books, there was actually an original Reek long before Theon that Ramsay grew up with, a figure who was servant to Ramsay, but also possibly something of a twisted father figure, long before Ramsay ever met Roose Bolton, and then the original Reek died dies, this constant figure in Ramsay's life. Suddenly he's gone. Therefore, at the first available opportunity, Ramsay attempts to create a new Reek via Theon to fill that kind of hole, torture Theon into becoming that same person. I think that tells you a lot about Ramsay's psychology and who he really is beneath this fear and dread. But in the show, there is no original Reek. I can fully understand why they cut that out, because you'd need to express it via exposition early on, which would feel like it'd be difficult to fit that exposition in a way that feels necessary until much later on. But Theon in the show is just called Reek because Ramsay happens to notice he smells and he wants to degrade him. Why? I don't know. Why does he want to make Theon into this obedient servant? You can kind of extrapolate the obvious points, like it's because he's sadistic, it's because he enjoys it, and all of those kind of points, but that's basically it in the show. There isn't any further specific exploration or any interesting dynamic between Ramsay and Theon, and therefore you end up with a character who feels like a very one-dimensional villain, a character who is very, very good at that one dimension, definitely, but one dimension nonetheless. So that's point 1 and 2. It's gratuitous and shallow, and we're not really exploring much about Ramsay. Point 3 is the humour. Book Ramsay isn't the charismatic, joking, quipping man we see Iwan Rheon do such a good job of portraying. The thing is, if you're going to have as many of these scenes as you do, scenes that tell us again and again there is no hope for Theon, his every hope is wrong, this is endless, it is horrifying, Ramsay is without limits, that's going to become a very depressing television experience. It's why ordinarily you wouldn't have too many scenes to tell us just that. Either explore something further, ideally about Theon and what he's enduring and his experiences there, or you'd cut away to different scenes and different characters. There's no need to linger here once we've got the point, you know? And again, a bit of discomfort is a good thing when it's challenging the audience and expressing something, but here, how do they stop this from just being a thoroughly unenjoyable viewing experience? Rather than keeping it brief, and rather than really exploring Theon, they inject humour through Ramsay to, I guess, kind of lighten it up. Humour, you could argue, very much adds to the horror, how someone can so intensely delight in what he's doing to the extent of all of these jokes. That could be very chilling, but I don't think the framing works enough for that. I think Iwan is too charismatic for it to feel as chilling as it deserves to be, and then you end up with scenes a lot of the audience find legitimately funny. In a way, it's personal taste that I don't find them funny. There's no part of me that laughs at Theon being tricked into an erection so that Ramsay can cut off his penis and then taunt him by eating a pork sausage. However, it is all a taboo thing to laugh at in an otherwise highly pressurized scene. Humour becomes a release, and the framing definitely contributes to why people find it funny, so I can see why people would laugh, and I can understand why the fandom spent ages memeing on this and cracking jokes at Theon's expense. Is that good, though? Because you end up with a situation where, despite everything, people actually kind of like Ramsay because they find him funny and charismatic. The framing and Ramsay's depiction kind of teaches the audience it's okay to laugh unempathetically at Theon, and so likewise, instead of scenes that should have us empathise with Theon, instead of that being a vehicle to explore all of this, it instead acts to draw the audience away from Theon, to dehumanise him. And I'm sure some of you will say that's the point, we're made to see him the way Ramsay sees Theon, but why? I don't think there's anywhere near enough depth for that to be a meaningful thing to do here, and I don't think you need it to go on as long as it does. And as a result, what you end up is with scenes that aren't just uncomfortable and kind of boring story-wise, but also glorifying what Ramsay does. That's all just the obvious thing to say about Ramsay, though. It's not the main thing I want to talk about. Let's move on. And also, allow me to shout to the heavens about...
You suggested
a World Anvil subscription.
Didn't you? I think that sounds like a wonderful idea.
World Anvil! Yep, they sponsored this video, they're still here, hopefully they'll stay here. World Anvil is an online tool for building worlds, creating characters, designing and managing campaigns for a whole slew of games. Slew isn't the right word, I don't know why I said that. Look, you can do all that, you can plan and write stories, you can do all sorts of different stuff for creative projects. I use it for the world building of my novel because my old system of massive Word documents became far too chaotic. Not only does the ability to create timelines with hyperlinks branching off to specific characters or articles or a billion other things, not only does that make it so much easier to quickly find the information I need, it also makes it so much easier to plan things out and kind of keep going. Sometimes a blank Word document for world building is very daunting, so having all sorts of tools to help with visualization, to help you figure out what needs planning next, to keep your brain fizzing and unimpeded, because all of the tools are very straightforward and easy to use. That's really important to me. It's like the sharper an artist's pencils, the freer they are to focus on the art. World Anvil is a very sharp pencil. You can create mind maps, you can rearrange elements of your story, do all sorts of campaign related things for that slew of games I mentioned. Yes, link in the description and as a pinned comment should you desire a 51% discount on all their subscriptions, or if you're not yet sure, then try out the free version for as long as you like. That's what I did at first, and now look where I am, shouting their name at you through a screen. World Anvil! If I were to argue there was a moment that did ruin Ramsay's character in Game of Thrones, I'd say one good contender is the few good men moment. Or at least that's a moment that underlines the main problem. How the hell did Ramsay ever become so incredibly powerful? Powerful to the extent all he needs is 20 good men to inexplicably completely cripple Stannis' army. Look, it's easier to explain this point again by comparing to Book Ramsay. I don't like just comparing to the books as though the books are perfect, but if you're going to adapt from a novel, you do it with a purpose. You make changes for a reason. Book Ramsay is an incredibly violent, sadistic, awful man who was given a position of power by his father Ramsay Bolton and made the Lord of Winterfell. Temporarily. However, him being given all of that isn't a reflection of his merit or his brilliance, because he's not at all brilliant. Book Ramsay isn't stupid, and he does possess a level of cunning and ruthlessness, but he's hardly a mastermind. He's not at all a skilled fighter, he's a competent rider at best, a very predictable tactician, and certainly not a man you'd ever describe as politically astute. He depends on his father much more than he'd ever care to admit, because whilst there is a degree of nuance here, Ramsay most certainly makes blunders, ones that seem to be leading towards his downfall. Ramsay's horror in the books comes directly from the fact that he isn't special or masterful at all. The horror exists in the fact that this is a world where such basic and kind of pathetic people are able to cause so much incalculable horror. A person doesn't have to be a mastermind to cause this, and to be one of the small folk in a world where for no good reasons at all you can end up at the mercy of a man like Ramsay and know there's absolutely nothing you can do about that. It's terrifying. Show Ramsay is elevated into someone supreme, almost supernatural at times. Show Ramsay can be effortlessly charming when he wants to be, and when he doesn't want to be, then it's fine. Murder and flay whoever you want. There will be zero consequences, Ramsay. In Season 5 he flays and kills Lord Cerwyn and his wife. Roose suggests it is dangerous to anger the other houses. He says that's a lot.
Stop eating and listen.
But it never actually feels like it, because nothing happens to Ramsay. The Manderleys are non-existent as a threat to the Boltons. Stannis is made incredibly weak. The Umbers and the Karstarks side with him, fine, but with a level of bizarre loyalty. Ramsay rips through scene after scene of this show, committing all sorts of atrocities, and somehow Littlefinger has barely heard anything about him.
Heard very little about you.
What? He can do what he likes, because it's convenient to the writers if they can show off how villainous Ramsay is at every conceivable opportunity. Joffrey could never do what he liked, and Joffrey was king.
The Mad King did as he liked. Has your Uncle Jamie ever told you what happened to him?
So, like, not only does all of this mean Ramsay gets an annoying level of plot armor, even early on in the story before the show became known for giving characters plot armor, but also all of his plot lines end up with the same basic repetitive arc, which is someone trying to do something against Ramsay, or us to hope there is some chance, some opportunity for freedom or escape, only for the show to immediately remind us, no, Ramsay is unstoppable. Maybe Theon will have a chance to, nope, Ramsay is unstoppable. Maybe Osha can, nope, but maybe Stannis will, nope, but if Yara can, nope, okay, but Sansa can get a candle to the top window, nope! The candle one is even literally that, like, the second Theon gets the candle and walks up the tower, Ramsay is there and finds out straight away. Like, they're so set on making Ramsay this powerful force that there's no tension to the scene. Every scene is like that. It's not the fact Ramsay always wins that bothers me, it's that he does so effortlessly, without ever feeling challenged or getting a single scratch or there being any back and forth in any of his arc. Even Ramsay Bolton, who does have some control over Ramsay, and there's this threat of him having a newborn son, there's never a point where Bruce, like, punishes Ramsay or causes him any threat, and even when the second son is born, Ramsay just immediately kills Roose.
Poisoned by our enemies.
There could have been a pressure there, you know, especially after Sansa and Theon just escaped. That should have been a massive stress. Roose should have been furious. Killing Roose itself should have felt like a risky move that might backfire in the long run. Instead, we have a perfectly composed Ramsay doing just whatever he wants, and it turning out well for him. Basically, they made a change from the kind of horror that Ramsay is expressing in the books. The kind of horror they wanted here is to draw on this semi-supernatural, unstoppable monster, where the horror is in the fact nothing you do can defeat it, like a kind of Jeepers Creepers or The Thing or whatever other horror movies I have a very vague recollection of. That kind of horror only works in specific settings though, either somewhere very contained, or in Book Euron's case, he has enough mystery to him that it can work, enough of this mystical quality that's happening at a distance where you don't fully understand or see all of it. There isn't that with Show Ramsay, and they draw him out too much until it starts to fall flat. At some point you end up with a character surviving solely on shock factor, charisma, and the imagined satisfaction the audience will get when he does eventually die. Because again, this isn't someone whose mistakes slowly weave together to cause his downfall, this is someone effortlessly succeeding all throughout even the Battle of Bastards, right until the very end of it. Sansa miraculously arrived at the last moment. Only now is Ramsay ever really doing anything wrong, and still he goes down with his same composed, quipping attitude.
I've reconsidered. I think that sounds like a wonderful idea.
So if point one was that his villainy becomes increasingly one-dimensional, point two is that all conflict and tension is removed. And in many ways I think both those factors can be attributed to Ramsay actually being too compelling a villain in concept. Like, so horrifying and hitting so well with the audience that they didn't want to do anything that undermined what made him hit, and so thrilling that they didn't want to kill him off too soon, for which he ends up drawn out with a lot of very convenient springboards to help him clear hurdles. But then there's also point 3. When you do have a compelling villain, what do you do with him? What you do is give him more screen time. No, more than that, you make him the focal point, the central antagonist for everything. Okay, not everything, because Game of Thrones is a vast world with lots of different stories playing out in different places. I can't argue Ramsay is the villain in Meereen or Braavos or whatever, but you do feel the world shrink as Ramsay becomes the main antagonist for Theon, Sansa, Jon Snow, Stannis, many of the wildlings. Brienne's story becomes wrapped up in saving Sansa. The main purpose of the Knights of the Vale are to kill Ramsay. Don't forget the Greyjoys either. In Season 3, Ramsay threatens them with what he will do to Theon if they don't retreat. Balon Greyjoy doesn't care and does nothing. Yara plans to save Theon. She waits a season, then fails to save him in a scene that changes very little, and then waits another 2 seasons of doing nothing for Ramsay to die before she then gets a new antagonist and new purpose in the story. Like, the Greyjoys become so tied to the Boltons that there's nothing else to do for them. Everything is streamlined towards Ramsay largely because because they knew people enjoyed Ramsay as a villain. But it's like people really enjoyed Tyrion as a character, only the problem is you precariously bend everything to try and accommodate what people like about that character, therefore losing a lot of the substance to what made him work in the first place, and you end up with a character that's a shell of himself. A character people still kind of enjoy because they did emotionally invest, but at some point you have to recognise that investment is starting to run at a loss. Walder Frey, what happens to him? Why is he not a villain anymore? Why is it just Ramsay? Minor villains like Locke died and the Mountain became this cyborg just existing in wait for his brother to fight him. No other villains are being created here. That's all a lot of weight on Ramsay's shoulders, and I think it makes the plot very straightforward. And then he dies, as he has to at some point, but because everything was streamlined into Ramsay being the antagonist, you're left with something of a black hole now that he's gone. There's a real absence of villains. Either the world has to shrink incredibly small to just have Dany, Cersei and the Night King, which is largely what happens, yes, and then people start flying all over Westeros at top speed so that you can get scenes playing out between them all, or you have to chuck someone new into the mix, which is Euron Greyjoy, and just... where do you start with him? Arguably Euron's problem is that the show wanted to create again what made Ramsay compelling right after Ramsay died. So you have a similarly very charismatic and joking villain whose horror is supposed to be how unstoppable they are, only there's not the time required to bed him in and develop the same level of horror, so he just ends up a shallow imitation of charismatic yet scary villain. And it's not just that Ramsay became the antagonist to everyone, that could potentially work. It's also that he means the same thing to everyone. The dynamics are all the same. He is a one-dimensional evil figure that people want to defeat because he's evil and because he caused them or someone they care about great trauma. You know, the only character who has a unique dynamic with Ramsay is Roose, because Roose is the father figure he somewhat depends on. Most of Ramsay's best scenes involve Roose in some way because it changes the dynamic and shows us another side to Ramsay. No one else does that. Whereas if you think like Joffrey, he is shut down by Tywin, caught in bitter rivalry with Tyrion, an unruly son to Cersei that she's losing touch with, manipulated by Marjorie, feared terribly by Sansa, endured with a forced indifference by the Hound, and someone for Littlefinger and Olenna to kill. There's so much variety going on there. If you're going to make Ramsay the centre focus in terms of villains, but you're not going to have any of that different mix of dynamics, then yes, Ramsay is going to reduce the layers to everything. The show becomes more empty in the way it ties itself to him. Ramsay exits the show in season 6, leaving the world of Game of Thrones much more barren than it was when he entered. And I didn't even mention Miranda, a character who only exists really for exposition scenes with Ramsay and nudity, but a character whose existence stopped Ramsay and Theon from getting to develop any specific and unique dynamic that would have helped to explore their stories. Generally, yes, I suppose I'm arguing that Ramsay was too compelling a villain for the story's own good. People were invested in Ramsay, and so David and Dan made the mistake of accommodating for that. But when you've got someone menacing like a Tuco Salamanca or a Ralph Cifaretto or a Joffrey, you've got to know when to kill them off. Otherwise, not only do you stretch them thin as a character, but you also have to stretch the world itself thin to keep them going. And what that means is once they do finally die, you end up with Season 7 and Season 8 of Game of Thrones in their wake. Not that Ramsay is the only one to blame, that'd be a very weird argument. And that line just felt like a good way to wrap this up. Where am I wrong though? Where am I simplifying things or missing something important? Barrage me with comments, or just like the video if you like this, subscribe, maybe even support me on Patreon. Otherwise, hopefully see you next time. And as ever, a special thank you goes to Grace, Luke Core, Treat You Caber, Michael Gallagher, Flying Spider, Kellyanne Davidson, Samara Salsey, Joshua C. Follier and Chad Bramwell. Thank you.